Hello, how are you today? And are you ready to hear mysteries? If you're ready, I'll tell you.
The Forbidden Path. Jake Reynolds was a seasoned truck driver, well versed in the rules of the road and the nuances of night driving. His latest assignment seemed routine, transporting a load of construction materials from Georgia to a remote site in West Virginia. The route was straightforward, but it included a stretch of road known for its eerie reputation. The locals called it the Forbidden Path. As Jake prepared to depart, his friend and fellow trucker, Sam, gave him a stern warning. "Whatever you do, Jake, don't pick up anyone on that road. It's cursed. People have seen things, terrifying things. Just keep driving, no matter what." Jake laughed it off, as he always did with ghost stories, but deep down, a sliver of unease took root. He shook it off, climbed into his truck, and began his journey. The first few hours were uneventful, with the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the tires on the asphalt as his only companions. As dusk fell, Jake approached the entrance to the Forbidden Path. The road sign was old and covered in vines, barely visible in the fading light. He turned onto the narrow, winding road, surrounded by dense forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Darkness fell quickly, and soon the only illumination came from his headlights, casting long, flickering shadows. The road was eerily quiet, with no other vehicles in sight. Jake adjusted his radio, hoping for some music to break the silence, but all he got was static. He switched it off, the silence now more oppressive than before. An hour into the drive, Jake saw something ahead, an indistinct figure standing by the side of the road. As he drew closer, he could make out a woman in tattered clothes, her face obscured by long, matted hair. She raised her hand, signaling for him to stop. Sam's warning echoed in Jake's mind. He slowed down, but didn't stop, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. The woman's figure faded into the rearview mirror, but a chill ran down his spine. He pressed on, his heart pounding. Not long after, Jake noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. He glanced to the right and saw a figure running alongside his truck, matching his speed. It was the same woman, her eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. Jake's blood ran cold. He accelerated, but the figure kept pace, her expression blank and unyielding. "Just keep driving," Jake muttered to himself, gripping the wheel tighter. He dared not look at her again, focusing on the road ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the figure disappeared, melting back into the shadows of the forest. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing denser with each passing mile. Suddenly, a loud thud shook the truck. Jake slammed on the brakes, heart racing. He looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Gathering his courage, he continued driving. A few miles later, he saw another figure standing in the middle of the road. This time, it was a man, his clothes dirty and torn, his eyes wide with fear. He stood motionless, blocking the way. Jake's instinct was to stop, but Sam's warning rang in his ears. He honked the horn, but the man didn't move. "Get out of the way," Jake shouted, but the figure remained. With no other choice, Jake swerved around him, narrowly avoiding a collision. In the rearview mirror, he saw the man standing still, staring after him. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Fatigue and fear gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated a group of figures standing on the roadside. They were all different men, women, children, all with the same vacant, haunting eyes. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He pressed down on the accelerator, speeding past them, their faces a blur in the darkness. The figures appeared more frequently now, some standing still, others running alongside the truck. They seemed to be everywhere, their presence growing more oppressive with each passing mile. Jake felt his sanity slipping, the constant barrage of ghostly apparitions wearing him down. He tried to focus on the road, but the figures grew bolder. One ran directly in front of the truck, forcing Jake to swerve violently. The truck skidded, but he managed to regain control. His breathing was ragged, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. Out of the darkness, he saw a dim light ahead of a gas station. Relief washed over him. He pulled in, the station's fluorescent lights flickering as he parted. The place was old and rundown, but it offered a semblance of safety. Jake got out, his legs trembling. He entered the station and was greeted by an elderly attendant who eyed him with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the attendant said, his voice raspy. Jake recounted his experiences, and the attendant nodded knowingly. "This road is cursed," he said. "Many have seen the spirits of those who died here, trapped between this world and the next. They try to warn travelers, but their presence brings madness. Why didn't you warn me?" Jake asked, frustration and fear mingling in his voice. The attendant shrugged. "Would you have believed me? Most don't. They think it's just stories." Jake shuddered. "How much farther to my destination?" "Not far," the attendant replied, "but be careful. The spirits grow more restless the closer you get. Don't stop for anything. Keep your eyes on the road and drive straight through." Jake thanked the attendant, filled up his tank, and steeled himself for the final leg of the journey. As he got back on the road, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He couldn't let the spirits break him. He had to make it through. The figures appeared again almost immediately, more numerous and aggressive than before. They ran alongside the truck, their ghostly forms flickering in the headlights. Some pounded on the windows, their faces contorted in silent screams. Jake kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look at them. The forest grew darker, the air colder. Jake's breath fogged the windshield, and he wiped it away, his hand shaking. The figures grew more desperate, throwing themselves at the truck, trying to force him to stop. He ignored them, focusing solely on the path ahead. The road began to climb, the forest giving way to rocky cliffs. Jake's heart pounded as he navigated the treacherous curves, the figures still in pursuit. They seemed to multiply, their ghostly forms filling the road behind him. At the crest of a hill, Jake saw a massive figure standing directly in his path. It was a woman, taller than any human should be, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She raised her hand, and the truck's engine sputtered. Jake felt a force trying to pull him to a stop, but he fought against it, pushing the accelerator to the floor. The truck lurched forward, the woman's form dissolving into mist as he sped through. The force holding him back dissipated, and the road ahead cleared. Jake glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures receding, their forms fading into the darkness. He drove on, the forest gradually giving way to open fields. The sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The figures were gone, and the oppressive sense of dread lifted. As the sun rose, he saw the factory in the distance. He pulled into the lot, exhausted but triumphant. The foreman greeted him, noting his pale face and trembling hands. "You made it," the foreman said, impressed. "Not many do. That road is something else, isn't it?" Jake nodded, too tired to speak. He unloaded his cargo and prepared for the return trip, this time planning a different route. As he drove away from the factory, he couldn't help but glance back at the forbidden path, now bathed in morning light. The memory of the ghostly figures and their haunting eyes would stay with him forever, a chilling reminder of the supernatural forces that lurk in the shadows of the night. Moonlit Shadows, a trucker's nightmare. Sam, a seasoned truck driver with over a decade of experience. He's known for his punctuality, reliability, and calm demeanor under pressure. Sam gets a last-minute assignment to deliver essential goods to a remote village deep in the mountains. He's promised a hefty bonus for completing the job. Sam meticulously checks his truck, loads the goods, and plans his route. He packs extra supplies, knowing the remote roads can be unforgiving. As Sam drives away from the bustling city, the urban lights fade. The landscape transforms into rolling hills and dense forests. Sam tunes into his favorite late-night radio show, which plays a mix of old rock and eerie ghost stories. The road becomes narrower and less maintained. Sam notices the first signs of unease, strange noises from the woods, fleeting shadows that seem to move unnaturally. He chalks it up to his imagination and fatigue. The road twists and turns through dense forests and up steep mountain paths. The full moon casts an eerie glow, illuminating the surroundings while also creating long, unsettling shadows. Sam spots animals acting unusually, a deer standing frozen in the middle of the road, an owl watching him with piercing eyes. He feels a growing sense of unease but pushes forward, determined to complete his delivery. Default Tech Sam sees the flashing lights of a patrol car in the distance. The officers, Deputy Ross and Officer Martinez, are friendly but thorough, asking routine questions and inspecting the truck. During the inspection, the officers warn Sam to be cautious. They mention local legends about strange sightings and skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures from Native American folklore. As they talk, both Sam and the officers feel an inexplicable sense of being watched. The patrol car leaves, but the sense of unease lingers with Sam. Sam resumes his journey, but the road becomes even more desolate. The sense of being watched intensifies. He decides to take a short break, pulling over to rest and gather his thoughts. The night is eerily quiet, and the silence is oppressive. While resting, Sam hears rustling in the bushes and sees a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight. He catches a glimpse of a distorted, almost human figure before it disappears into the darkness. Sam's heart races as he recalls the officer's warning. Sam continues driving, now hyper-aware of every shadow and sound. The road becomes more treacherous, with sharp turns and steep inclines. He sees the figure again, this time closer. The skinwalker appears to taunt him, staying just within sight but out of reach. Sam's rational mind struggles to make sense of the supernatural encounter. The road ahead is blocked by a fallen tree, forcing Sam to stop. The sense of being watched intensifies, and he knows he's not alone. The skinwalker approaches, and Sam musters his courage to confront it. He uses his knowledge of folklore and personal bravery to drive the creature away, invoking protection rituals he learned from a friend. The encounter becomes physical, with Sam narrowly escaping the skinwalker's grasp. The tension and fear are palpable as he fights to survive. Sam manages to remove the tree and continues his journey, but the sense of being watched persists. His hands tremble, and his mind races with thoughts of the creature. He reaches the village at dawn, exhausted but safe. The villagers thank him and share their own tales of encounters with the skinwalker, affirming his experience. An elder in the village reveals that the skinwalker is drawn to those who travel alone at night, seeking to instill fear and confusion. Sam returns to the city, but the experience leaves a lasting impression on him. He feels a lingering sense of unease, even in familiar surroundings. Sam shares his story with other truckers, warning them of the dangers lurking in the shadows of the remote roads. His tale spreads, becoming a cautionary legend among his peers. Sam vows to be more cautious in the future, respecting local legends and the natural world. He carries with him the memory of that moonlit night and the creature that haunted him, a constant reminder of the unknown dangers that exist in the world. Shadows of the Forgotten Woods. Tom had been driving trucks for years, but tonight's journey felt different. He was delivering a load from Georgia to a remote town in the Appalachian Mountains. The route was notorious among truckers for its desolate stretches and the eerie legends that surrounded it. Locals called it the Forgotten Woods, a dense forest said to be haunted by restless spirits and mysterious creatures. The most important rule was never to acknowledge or respond to anything you might see or hear. Megan, Tom's wife, decided to join him on this trip. She was a skeptic, always dismissing Tom's stories of the supernatural as mere folklore. Determined to prove him wrong, she insisted on accompanying him, convinced that nothing would happen. As they prepared to leave, Tom's friend Greg gave him a stern warning. "Tom, remember the rule. Don't speak to or acknowledge anything, and tell Megan to stay quiet too." Tom nodded, although he was worried about how Megan would handle the situation. She had always been headstrong and curious, traits that might put them in danger. The first part of their journey was uneventful. The sun set as they neared the entrance to the Forgotten Woods. The road sign was nearly invisible, overgrown with moss and vines. As they entered the forest, a sense of foreboding settled over Tom. He glanced at Megan, who seemed unfazed, busy scrolling through her phone. "Are you sure this place is haunted?" Megan asked, looking up at the dark, dense forest surrounding them. Just remember what I said. "No talking to anything you see or hear," Tom replied, his voice tense. Megan rolled her eyes. "You and your ghost stories." As they drove deeper into the woods, the darkness became almost tangible. The headlights cast eerie shadows on the narrow road, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Tom kept a tight grip on the wheel, trying to ignore the growing anxiety gnawing at him. An hour into the journey, Tom saw a movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadowy figure stood at the side of the road, barely visible. As they approached, he saw it was a woman in ragged clothes, her face hidden by her hair. She raised a hand, as if to wave them down. "We should help her," Megan said, leaning forward. "No, we can't," Tom insisted, his heart racing. "Remember what I said," Megan frowned. "That's ridiculous, Tom. She might need help." Tom ignored her and kept driving. The woman's figure faded into the darkness behind them. Megan shivered, finally beginning to feel uneasy. A few miles later, they heard strange noises outside the truck. It started as a faint whispering, then grew louder, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. "Do you hear that?" Megan asked, her voice trembling. "Just ignore it," Tom replied through gritted teeth. "Don't respond." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Megan covered her ears, her face pale with fear. "This is insane, Tom. What's going on?" Suddenly, a creature darted in front of the truck. Tom swerved, narrowly avoiding it. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a strange, shadowy figure with glowing eyes staring after them. "What was that?" Megan exclaimed. "Just keep quiet," Tom said, his voice shaking. "We can't acknowledge it." The road seemed endless, the forest growing darker and more oppressive. The whispers continued, mingling with strange animal sounds. Tom's mind was fraying, the constant stress wearing him down. Megan was on the verge of panic, her skepticism replaced by fear. As they rounded a bend, they saw a group of figures standing by the roadside. Men, women, and children, all with hollow eyes and sad expressions. They reached out as the truck passed, their faces twisted in sorrow. "We have to turn back," Megan pleaded. "We're almost through," Tom said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Suddenly, an eerie howl echoed through the forest. Tom's blood ran cold. The howl was followed by a series of strange, unearthly growls. The creature from earlier seemed to be following them, its glowing eyes visible in the darkness. "What is that?" Megan cried. "Just don't speak," Tom repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The creature appeared again, running alongside the truck, its form shifting and changing in the shadows. It was like nothing Tom had ever seen, a grotesque blend of different animals, with a twisted, almost human face. Tom pushed the truck to its limits, the engine roaring as they sped down the narrow road. The creature kept pace, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Megan was crying, her fear overwhelming. Out of the darkness, they saw a faint light ahead. It was an old, dilapidated gas station. Tom pulled in, the station's flickering lights casting long shadows. He parked and turned off the engine, both of them shaking. They stumbled into the gas station, where an old man stood behind the counter, watching them with a knowing look. "You've been through the Forgotten Woods, haven't you?" Tom nodded, too exhausted to speak. Megan clung to him, her face pale. The old man sighed. "The woods are cursed. The spirits and creatures you saw are trapped, unable to find peace." They try to draw you in, to make you one of them. Is there any way to get through safely? Tom asked, his voice hoarse. Just keep driving, the old man said. Don't stop. Don't speak to them. You're almost out. Tom thanked him and filled the tank. As they got back on the road, the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them once more. The figures reappeared, their ghostly forms more menacing. The whispers grew louder, blending with the creature's eerie howls. Just a little longer, Tom said, his voice shaking. We're almost through. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing denser and more foreboding. Tom's mind was fraying, the relentless assault on his senses pushing him to the brink. The figures seemed to grow bolder, their faces pressing against the windows, their hands pounding on the doors. In a final act of desperation, Tom floored the accelerator, pushing the truck to its limits. The figures fell behind, their ghostly forms fading into the distance. The whispers subsided, replaced by the roar of the engine. The first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, the forest beginning to thin. Tom could see the end of the road ahead, a welcome sight after the nightmare they had endured. As they emerged from the forgotten woods, the oppressive weight lifted, the figures disappearing entirely. They reached their destination, both exhausted and shaken. Tom parked the truck and turned to Megan, who was still pale and trembling. "We made it," he said, his voice weak. Megan nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you, Tom. I had no idea." Tom pulled her into a tight embrace, the relief washing over them both. They had survived the forgotten woods, but the memory of that night would stay with them forever, a haunting reminder of the supernatural forces that lurked in the darkness. The Phantom Highway. Jake Cooper was no stranger to long-haul trucking, but the route from Texas to a remote factory in rural Louisiana was new to him. The dispatcher had given him a midnight departure, ensuring he would travel the eeriest parts of the journey in the dead of night. Jake shrugged it off, thinking it was just another job, but he couldn't shake the sense of foreboding as he set off down the desolate highway. The initial hours were uneventful, with only the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires on asphalt to keep him company. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense forest that seemed to swallow any light. Jake glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3 a.m., the witching hour. Needing a break, Jake found a secluded pull-off area by the road. The place was silent, except for the distant hoot of an owl. He turned off the engine, leaned back, and closed his eyes, trying to rest. Moments later, a soft knock echoed from the passenger side window. His eyes snapped open. In the dim light, he saw a pale face pressed against the glass. A woman, her eyes hollow and pleading. Jake's heart raced. He reached for the door handle, but hesitation stopped him. The figure outside was not just a woman. She seemed almost ethereal, her form flickering as if caught between this world and the next. Another knock, more insistent this time. Jake started the engine, his hands trembling. As he sped away, he glanced in the mirror and saw her fading into the darkness. Determined to make it to his destination without further interruptions, Jake drove through the night. The road was eerily empty, with no other vehicles in sight. The isolation weighed on him, every shadow seeming to move in the corner of his eye. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled to life, emitting static that quickly turned into a low, mournful wail. Jake tried to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. The wail grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of voices, all whispering his name. Jake's pulse quickened. He punched the radio, and the voices stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. A few miles down the road, Jake saw a figure standing in the middle of the lane. He swerved violently to avoid it, his truck skidding to a halt on the shoulder. Panting, he looked back and saw the same woman from earlier, now standing in the road, her eyes fixed on him. She lifted her hand and pointed down the road before disappearing. Shaken, Jake continued driving, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He approached a narrow bridge flanked by thick fog, the air growing colder with each passing second. As he crossed, the fog enveloped the truck, obscuring everything. Then he saw her again, standing at the edge of the bridge, her eyes filled with sorrow. The temperature inside the cab plummeted, and Jake could see his breath. He pressed on the accelerator, desperate to leave the bridge behind. Just as he reached the other side, a deafening bang echoed through the truck, followed by the sound of scraping metal. Jake looked in the mirror and saw deep claw marks running along the side of the trailer. Jake's resolve was crumbling. He needed to reach the factory, anything to escape this nightmare. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in. He spotted an old, abandoned gas station up ahead and decided to stop, hoping to gather his wits. As he stepped out of the truck, the air was heavy with a sense of dread. The station's lights flickered, casting long shadows. Jake approached the building, peering through the grimy windows. Inside, he saw old, dusty shelves and a flickering neon sign, but no signs of life. Suddenly, a loud bang came from behind him. He turned to see the ghostly woman standing by his truck, her hand resting on the door. She looked at him with a mixture of sorrow and desperation. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. Jake's fear was replaced by a strange sense of calm. He approached her slowly, feeling a connection to this tormented spirit. "How can I help you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman gestured toward the back of the truck. Jake walked around and opened the trailer doors, revealing the cargo inside crates filled with industrial supplies. Among the crates, he found an old, weathered diary. The name Eleanor was etched on the cove. Jake flipped through the pages, reading about a woman named Eleanor who had lived in a nearby town. She had lost her family in a tragic accident on this very road and had spent her remaining days searching for answers. Her spirit had been trapped, wandering the highway, unable to find peace. Jake realized what he had to do. He took the diary and followed the directions Eleanor had pointed out earlier. It led him to a small, overgrown graveyard hidden in the woods. There, he found a grave marked with Eleanor's name and the names of her family members. He placed the diary on the grave and whispered a prayer for Eleanor and her family. As he did, a soft glow enveloped the graveyard, and the air grew warmer. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Eleanor, now smiling, her form becoming more solid and peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading into the light. Jake returned to his truck, feeling a profound sense of relief. The journey to the factory was uneventful, the haunting presence lifted. When he arrived, the night guard listened to his story with a knowing nod. "You're not the first to help her," the guard said. "Eleanor's been searching for peace for decades. It's good to know she's finally found it." As Jake drove back to Texas, he couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the road and the stories it held. The Phantom Highway, once a place of fear, had become a path to peace, thanks to one truck driver's courage and compassion. The road to darkness. Jake Malone was an experienced truck driver, familiar with countless highways and byways across the country. He'd driven through deserts, mountains, and cities, but this route was new to him. His job was to deliver a shipment from Dallas, Texas, to a small factory in rural Mississippi. The journey started on a well-lit, bustling interstate, but as he approached the outskirts of Louisiana, he received a call from his dispatcher. "Jake, there's been an accident on your planned route," the dispatcher said. "You'll need to take the old rural highway for the last leg of the trip." Jake sighed but agreed. He had heard rumors about that stretch of road, but he wasn't one to be swayed by tales of the supernatural. However, his friend and fellow trucker, Sam, had once told him about a spine-chilling experience on that very route. "Jake, I'm telling you, don't take that road at night," Sam had warned. "I drove it once, and it was the most terrifying experience of my life. The lights of the city disappear, and you're left in pitch darkness. I saw things, Jake, things that shouldn't exist." Jake had laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to Sam's overactive imagination. But now, as he faced the prospect of driving that route himself, he felt a twinge of unease. The first part of the journey was uneventful, with the city lights guiding him. The interstate was crowded with cars, their headlights creating a river of light that flowed through the night. Jake felt secure, surrounded by the hum of traffic and the bright neon signs of roadside businesses. As he approached the turnoff for the rural highway, he decided to stop for fuel. He pulled into a small gas station on the edge of town, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow. The station seemed almost deserted, with only one attendant behind the counter. Jake got out to stretch his legs and was greeted by the attendant, an older man with a weathered face and piercing eyes. "You heading down the old highway tonight?" the attendant asked, eyeing Jake's truck. "Yeah, I have a delivery to make," Jake replied. The attendant shook his head. "It's not a good idea, son. That road. Strange things happen there, especially after dark. I've seen drivers come through here, scared out of their wits, telling tales of ghosts and other things that lurk in the shadows. If you can, wait until morning." Jake appreciated the concern, but was on a tight schedule. "I don't have a choice. I need to make this delivery tonight." The attendant sighed. "If you must go, be careful. Keep your wits about you and don't stop for anything." Jake filled up his tank, thanked the attendant, and got back on the road. The highway started off normal enough, with the city lights gradually giving way to fewer and fewer signs of civilization. The road narrowed, and the trees on either side grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Soon, he was enveloped in darkness, the only light coming from his truck's headlights. As the hours passed, the isolation became oppressive. The occasional farmhouse light was a distant memory, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Jake turned on the radio to distract himself. All he got was static. He tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, reminding himself that Sam's stories were just that, stories. Suddenly, Jake saw something dart across the road. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. Heart pounding, he peered into the darkness but saw nothing. Shaking his head, he started the truck again and continued, though his nerves were now on edge. A few miles later, he saw a figure standing by the roadside. It was a woman, dressed in a white gown, her face obscured by long, dark hair. Jake's first instinct was to stop and offer help, but Sam's warning echoed in his mind. Instead, he drove past. Glancing in the rearview mirror, the woman was gone. The road seemed to close in on him, the darkness becoming almost tangible. Jake felt a chill run down his spine and turned up the heater, but it did little to dispel the cold. He focused on the road, determined to reach his destination as quickly as possible. Without warning, a loud bang resonated through the truck. Jake pulled over to check but found nothing wrong. As he climbed back into the cab, he heard a faint tapping on the window. He froze, his breath visible in the cold air. Slowly, he turned and saw a ghostly face peering at him. Eyes wide with terror, he blinked, and it was gone. Jake's hands trembled as he started the truck and drove on. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. He tried to ignore it, but the sound became almost deafening. Desperate, he floored the accelerator, the truck barreling down the deserted road. The landscape around him changed subtly. The trees seemed to bend towards the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, and Jake felt as if he was being watched by unseen eyes. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. Just when he thought he couldn't take any more, he saw a dim light ahead. It was a small, dilapidated church, its doors open wide. Desperate for any sense of sanctuary, Jake pulled into the churchyard. As he stepped out of the truck, the air grew still, and the oppressive sense of dread lifted slightly. Inside the church, he found an old priest, hunched over a book. The priest looked up, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and relief. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This place is not safe, especially at night." "I had no choice," Jake replied, his voice shaking. "I needed to get off the road." The priest nodded. "You've encountered them. Haven't you? The spirits that roam the highway. Jake recounted his experiences, and the priest listened intently. Many years ago, there was a tragic accident on that road, the priest explained. A family died, and their spirits have been restless ever since. They appear to warn travelers, but those who see them are often driven to madness. A cold chill ran down Jake's spine. What can I do? The priest handed him a small vial of holy water. Sprinkle this on your truck and pray. It's not much, but it may offer some protection. And whatever you do, don't stop until you reach your destination. Jake thanked the priest and returned to his truck. He did as instructed, sprinkling the holy water and saying a prayer. As he got back on the road, the tapping ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The final leg of the journey was a blur of fear and determination. Jake kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look at the shadows that seemed to follow him. Hours passed, and finally, the factory lights appeared in the distance. He pulled into the factory lot, exhausted but relieved. The foreman greeted him, noting his pale face and trembling hands. Rough night. You have no idea, Jake replied, recounting his harrowing journey. The foreman nodded sympathetically. That road's got a reputation. You're lucky you made it. Jake finished his delivery and prepared for the return trip. This time, he planned to stick to the main highways, even if it meant a longer journey. As he drove away from the factory, the sun began to rise, casting the first light of dawn over the landscape. Despite the horrors of the night, Jake felt a sense of triumph. He had faced the darkness and survived. But the memory of the phantom highway and its restless spirits would stay with him forever, a chilling reminder of the unknown terrors that lurk in the shadows of the night. Whispers in the Dark, the Forbidden Forest. Jake had been a truck driver for over a decade, navigating countless roads and enduring long, solitary nights. But this journey was different. He was tasked with delivering a load of essential supplies from Tennessee to a remote town in Kentucky. The route he had to take was infamous among truckers, known as the Forbidden Forest. It was a desolate, winding road that cut through an eerie, thick forest. Local legends warned that the road was haunted, and the rule was clear: never acknowledge, speak to, or respond to anything you see or hear. Jake's wife, Lisa, decided to accompany him on this trip. She was skeptical of the supernatural and often laughed at Jake's stories of ghostly encounters. This time, she was determined to see for herself what all the fuss was about. As they prepared to leave, Jake's friend Sam pulled him aside. Jake, remember, no matter what you see or hear, don't speak. Don't acknowledge them, just keep driving. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure how he would convince Lisa to follow the rule. He knew she didn't believe in such things, and her curiosity might put them both at risk. The first few hours of the journey were uneventful. The sun was setting as they approached the entrance to the Forbidden Forest. The road sign was barely visible, covered in rust and vines. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as they entered the shadowy path. He glanced at Lisa, who was busy on her phone, seemingly unfazed by the growing darkness. The forest quickly enveloped them, the tall trees forming a dense canopy overhead. The headlights cut through the darkness, casting long, flickering shadows on the narrow road. Jake tried to stay focused, his grip on the steering wheel tightening with each mile. Wow, it's really dark out here, Lisa remarked, looking up from her phone. Creepy, but still just a bunch of trees. Jake forced a smile, his mind racing with Sam's warning. Yeah, it's just the forest, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But remember what I told you. No talking to anyone we see. Lisa rolled her eyes. You and your superstitions. An hour into the drive, Jake spotted movement ahead. A figure stood by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light. As they drew closer, he saw a woman in a tattered dress, her face obscured by long, matted hair. She raised her hand, as if to wave them down. Lisa leaned forward, Should we stop? She looks like she needs help. Jake's heart pounded. No, we can't stop. Just ignore her, Lisa frowned. That's not right. Jake, we should help her. No, Lisa, Jake said firmly, his voice trembling. We can't. Trust me. They passed the woman, who turned to watch them go, her eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. Lisa shivered and sank back into her seat. Okay, that was creepy, she admitted. But still, it's just a coincidence. Jake said nothing, focusing on the road ahead. The silence between them was heavy, the tension palpable. A few miles later, Jake heard a faint whispering sound. It grew louder, as if multiple voices were speaking all at once, just outside the truck. He tried to block it out, but the voices seemed to be calling his name. Lisa turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. Do you hear that? Jake nodded, his face pale. Remember, don't respond. Don't say anything. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Lisa covered her ears, her expression one of sheer terror. This is insane, Jake. What's happening? Jake didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to shut out the voices. Suddenly, a figure darted in front of the truck. Jake swerved, narrowly missing it. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, staring after them with hollow eyes. Lisa was trembling. Jake, what was that? I don't know, Jake replied, his voice shaky. But we can't stop. We have to keep going. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness growing thicker with each passing mile. The whispers continued, sometimes sounding like laughter, other times like mournful cries. Jake's mind was fraying, the relentless onslaught of supernatural phenomena wearing him down. As they rounded a bend, they saw a group of figures standing by the roadside. Men, women, and children, all with vacant, haunting eyes. They reached out as the truck passed, their faces twisted in sorrow. Lisa gasped, tears streaming down her face. Jake, this is too much. We have to turn back. We can't, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. We have to make it through. The figures grew more frequent, their appearances more disturbing. Some ran alongside the truck. Others stood in front of it, forcing Jake to swerve to avoid them. The constant strain was taking its toll. Lisa was sobbing, her disbelief replaced by abject terror. Out of the darkness, they saw a dim light ahead. It was an old, run-down gas station. Jake pulled in, the station's lights flickering eerily. He parked and turned off the engine, his hand shaking. They entered the gas station, the interior just as decrepit as the exterior. An elderly attendant stood behind the counter, watching them with a knowing look. You've been on the forbidden path, haven't you? Jake nodded, too exhausted to speak. Lisa clung to him, still trembling. The attendant sighed. That road is cursed. The spirits of those who died there are trapped, unable to find peace. They try to reach out, but anyone who acknowledges them is pulled into their torment. Is there any way to get through safely? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Just keep driving, the attendant said. Don't stop. Don't speak to them. You're almost through. Stay strong. Jake thanked the attendant and filled up the tank. As they got back on the road, the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them once more. The figures reappeared, their ghostly forms more menacing than before. The whispers grew louder, filling the cab with an almost tangible presence. Lisa clutched Jake's arm. I can't take it anymore, Jake. This is too much. Just a little longer, Jake said, his voice shaking. We're almost through. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing denser and more foreboding. Jake's mind was fraying, the relentless assault on his senses pushing him to the brink. The figures seemed to grow bolder, their faces pressing against the windows, their hands pounding on the doors. In a final act of desperation, Jake floored the accelerator, pushing the truck to its limits. The figures fell behind, their ghostly forms fading into the distance. The whispers subsided, replaced by the roar of the engine. The first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, the forest beginning to thin. Jake could see the end of the road ahead, a welcome sight after the nightmare they had endured. As they emerged from the forbidden forest, the oppressive weight lifted, the figures disappearing entirely. They reached their destination, both exhausted and shaken. Jake parked the truck and turned to Lisa, who was still pale and trembling. "We made it," he said, his voice weak. Lisa nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you, Jake. I had no idea." Jake pulled her into a tight embrace, the relief washing over them both. They had survived the forbidden forest, but the memory of that night would stay with them forever, a haunting reminder of the supernatural forces that lurked in the darkness.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness. If you enjoyed this tale, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more chilling stories of the unknown.